everyone see these? So thank you for joining us today. As everyone knows, our speakers, Sandip, whose brainchild is the Clash of Titans, and Graciela, our past president, will debate the value of online learning. Certainly in COVID, in the last 2 years, it's been a challenge to our mission statement, which you see here. The International Society for Pediatric Neurosurgery will promote the health of children throughout the world by encouraging ethical transmission and exchange of neuroscientific information and techniques related to pediatric neurosurgery. And certainly we've gone from the classroom setting, as you see here, to virtual learning, where you don't know whether your audience is there or not. You may just see their name and not their face. You don't know who you're speaking to. But at the same time, the reach of virtual learning has been huge. If we look at these, this is the exit survey from our recent virtual meeting in December. And if you look, we had a total of 1,256 registrants, 530 of which were not ISPN members, but were glad to join us virtually for the meeting from their home. And if you look at the history of the attendance of our in-person meetings, it's typically been the last couple of years between 250 and 350 people. So the advantage of a virtual meeting is 1,250 registrants. And the question is, where do we go in the future? And this, by the exit poll, about a third of our membership says that they would like to return to in-person meetings. About 2/3 of our membership says that they would like a hybrid meeting where they have the option to do either. So with no further ado, I will finish up by showing this email from Dackling Pang. He's one of the best teachers I've ever known. I've never been to a lecture from him where I didn't come away learning tremendous amounts. And when asked to participate in this Clash of Titans, he says, "I'm afraid I've come to abhor virtual computer teaching. I find it so lacking compared to the face-to-face teaching we've grown used to that I have declined all such invitations. I would be more than happy to teach whenever real-life conference is assumed when things are better. My apologies, Dackling." So with that, I'll turn the screen over to Sandip, and I look forward to the next hour. Remember, if you have questions, post them on the chat room, and we'll address the questions at the end of the symposium. Thank you.
Just correcting before, Rick Boop, it was my mistake. Your name, please. Thank you and welcome, Sandip.
Okay, can you see my slide?
Yes.
Yes.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Nelsie, to this Clash of the Titans. Although I have to say that I am not a titan at all in pediatric neurosurgery, and certainly not half as titanic as my honorable opponent in this debate today. But I think what we're talking about and what I have to tell you from my side of the motion is that the teaching of pediatric neurosurgery as the pandemic ends will change dramatically forever. And if there's any slide which vindicates my position, it is this one that you have up already. Because this is the 20th Clash of the Titans that the Education Committee is hosting on behalf of the ISPN. And the very fact that you're hosting 20 virtual debates during the pandemic suggests that at least the ISPN has come to accept that teaching of pediatric neurosurgery has changed and will change for some time to come. So in fact, my side of the debate could easily end with this slide itself. But because Nelsie would not like that, I will have to take up a formal debating position. And whatever I say, I have to confess, will in no way reduce my respect for my opponent. Although I may rubbish the message, I will completely respect the messenger, the first ever lady president of our organization, a lady whose achievements, clinical profile, her success as a human being, I can never hope to emulate in my professional lifetime. Let's start off by arguing on this side with some definitions. What do we mean by education? I always define education when our residents come saying education is not the art of answering questions, it is the science of questioning answers. Education in pediatric neurosurgery, as I'm going to talk about for the next 15 minutes or so, is going to be education in pediatric surgery worldwide as imparted through the good offices of the ISPN. What does the word dramatically in the motion mean? Well, it means that something happens with such abruptness or suddenness that it not only has a scientific, a social, but also a psychological effect on all the people that it involves. And forever in this motion refers to the life expectancy of all the current faculty members of the ISPN. And that's the definitions with which I will proceed. I have to confess that I am not half as titanic as my opponent, and I wondered what are my qualifications to give you a talk like this today. Certainly my qualification is not that I've been a chairman of the education committee for the last 4 years. It's not that I've been co-chair of an education committee of the Asia Australasian Society. It's not even that I've now been a professor of neurosurgery for 23 years or a teacher for 28. But I'll tell you what's my qualification to give this talk. The qualification is that I'm a member of the species of Homo sapiens that has so far survived this pandemic. Let's take a step back to the calendar of end of 2019, early 2020, a time when most of us in the ISPN Education Committee were flying to and fro from different continents, running courses. This is my presentation to the last physical EB we had in the ISPN meeting in Birmingham. And you can see how we traveled that year, or in that particular ISPN year, to Yangon, Moscow, Bandung, Delhi, Dhaka, Accra, Ganzhou, Astana, Tbilisi, Argentina. And I hate to confess that the chairman of the education committee attended all but one of these courses at that time. As we crisscrossed this planet, making big holes in the ozone layer, and went to attend physical courses in different parts of the planet. That was my last presentation in Birmingham, when I went out with the begging bowl to the EB and said, we need $35,500 for the faculty. And we need a budget of about $60,000, a point I will come back to when we talk about the reasons why education will change. And then suddenly there descended upon us this brainless blob of RNA. And indeed, we realized what the impact it has, the impact it had on us, on our friends, on our families, on our fraternity. And the ISPN was one of the first organizations to share the grief of this pandemic that had descended down on us. I'm going to tell you what I think are the lessons learned by us, not as neurosurgeons or pediatric neurosurgeons, but as human beings, because I think this has impact on what I'm going to tell you over the next few minutes. And I always say we learned the 3 H's. We learned the H for humility. For here was a race which had been told by Dr. Darwin some years ago that we were the most evolved species to inhabit this planet, now being brought down to our knees by a small piece of RNA. We learned that we had invested billions and billions of dollars to keep this earth safe from a world war by investing in weapons of war. But we had not invested even a millionth of that amount to prevent the onslaught from a virus. The second H we learned during the pandemic is, I think, we learned human values. We learned to do more with less. We learned how to live a life without going to shopping malls and the cinema, without traveling, without going to parties and social occasions. We even learned how to give lectures, run companies, indeed, run the ISPN from the safety of our homes. And if I dare so, we even learned to give lectures wearing a jacket and tie with shorts or less underneath. And finally, the third H we learned about was our home, where we realized the sanctity and safety of the place we called home. And we realized the importance of the individuals that inhabit that home that we scarcely seem to have time for before the pandemic descended on us. And I think these three H's that we learned would have an impact on our civilization over the next century, certainly in the field of education. So what do we think is the future of pediatric neurosurgical education before I go further? I think the future is hybrid courses, courses where some faculty and some trainees are physically present and the rest are present virtually. Emphasis that changes from having a didactic lecture given by Dakling Pang to an audience of 200 to a one-to-one mentorship where somebody goes and spends a year or 6 months with Rick Boop or Jeff Blount. And finally, I think virtual learning and virtual teaching will improve and will have to improve so that the likes of amazing teachers like Dakling Pang too find that they can do virtual teaching and get the same amount of kick that they got out of physical teaching. So what are the reasons why neurosurgical education in the world of pediatric neurosurgery is going to change? And I'm going to use the following letters to drive home my point. The reasons are L for logistics, M for money, N for numbers, O for options, and P for what I call prejudices. And I will elaborate on each one of these. What's going to be change in logistics? There's going to be change of logistics on part of the organizers of the course, part of the faculty, part of the ISPN Education Committee. The organizers who had to look for resources to run a course. And remember, a lot of these ISPN courses were held in economically not so better off parts of this earth. Then they had to look for a venue which was suitable, which was politically neutral, which was acceptable by all the local and regional neurosurgeons. They had to look for a hotel which was not too expensive, but was good enough to host a faculty that would be flying in from thousands and thousands of miles across the continents to be part of the ISPN course. And most importantly, they had to ensure that they didn't have a faculty of 6 talking to an audience of 16. They had to ensure there was audience. That meant residents who would have to take time off on a Friday or Saturday or a Sunday to attend the course. And finally, they had to organize what I call recreation. They had to organize a fun trip for the faculty and the residents to give them a tour of the local region. And all this involved a lot of logistics on the part of an organizer who may in fact be struggling with resources. The faculty itself had to continuously brace itself for travel. I calculated that I was away in the year 2019 for 34 weekends of the year. They had to leave practice. They had to leave home, generally over weekends, sacrificing valuable time they could have spent with the family to understand that their priorities were to try and carry the mantle of pediatric neurosurgical education across the seas to other parts of the world. And remember, all this changed as we understood the importance of home, as I talked to you about a short while ago, as we were in the grip of the pandemic. For the ISPN itself, there was the logistics of finding faculty who were willing to travel and didn't cancel last moment, find venues with audience need, and of course, and I shared with you a typical budget of a year, they had to finance the courses, and the chairman of the education committee had to take out the begging bowl and go to the EB every year and said, can we have a little more money, please, because we're running a course in X, Y, and Z. Well, all these logistics would change with the pandemic, and there would be no need for such complicated logistics on the part of either the organizers, the faculty, or the ISPN. From L for logistics to M for money, and this is obvious. The reimbursement for faculty in the last year that we had physical courses was $55,000 US plus. It was not easy to persuade good teachers to travel because a lot of them had very, very important practices that they could not sacrifice 3 or 4 times a year. And yet the education committee had to ensure that standards were maintained. And unfortunately, whether you like it or not, it is money that makes the world go round. And of course, this amount of money will no longer be necessary as we move to a world of hybrid courses. Look at the budget request I made in my last disclosure to the ISPN EB before we stopped physical courses. For 8 courses, here's an additional allocation I requested. You see that last line. And every year it was the same story, making an additional request. So from L for logistics and M for money, N for numbers. Look at the advantage of numbers in the hybrid courses. You could have a huge number of faculty members. You could increase the number of trainees. Just to share with you, the virtual courses we held last year, in my last year as chairman of the education committee. Look at the virtual courses, 300 registrants in Moscow, 100 in Vietnam, India, Bangladesh, and Brazil, and almost 90 in Africa. So certainly you could have a much larger participation. If you had a course hybrid, you could have a third or half of the residents attend physically, and the rest could be virtual. And look at the advantage of faculty. We had 10 faculty for every course. Now the ISPN educational course, by the norms laid down by the EB, permits 4 faculty for a 2-day course, 5 for a 3-day course. You could have 10 because these were attending virtually without any expense to the ISPN. Look at the advantage of having more numbers as we change into a hybrid form. And finally, L, M, N, O for options. You could have an option of physical versus hybrid. The ratio could be determined by the biological safety, by the country, by what was the opinion of the faculty that you choose. So you have an option of 12, 15 faculty for a course. Imagine 15 teachers from different continents of the world being able to lecture in a single course. And of course, very, very important option was the option of resource reallocation that will be there on the part of the ISPN. Instead of funding courses where you pay 10 professors to travel thousands of miles to go from their home to the place of the course, you could only have 4 physically present. You could use your resources to fund fellowships, mentorships on a one-to-one basis. And finally, P for prejudices. Why we will have prejudices that will haunt our race for many, many years to come. As I see it, international travel will never be the same again, as we have our nostrils tickled before we get to the airports every time we go to be a faculty for a course. Why some countries will always be blamed for having started the pandemic, some for having contributed vicious mutants of the virus to the pandemic, and faculty will try and avoid these countries. There will be prejudices amongst faculty, some of whom will come physically and others who cannot. And that may involve vaccinations, comorbidities, age, etc., on part of the faculty. And remember, some of the very senior teachers of pediatric neurosurgery are some of the best teachers we have as well. So that's the L, M, N, O, and P of why the life in pediatric neurosurgical education has to change. As Lord Alfred Tennyson wrote in his famous poem, Passing of Arthur, the old order changeth, yielding place to new. And God fulfills himself in many ways, lest one good custom should corrupt the world. And with apologies to Lord Tennyson, in this case, I think the word should be lest one good virus should corrupt the world. We have to change the old order, yielding place to new. Don't get me wrong. I still think it is great fun to teach in a course where you have physical and psychological interaction on the part of the audience. It is much less fun to treat or talk to an audience like this. But we have to be faced with reality of what the world order will be now. And in the new order, you have to understand, as I say, and I'm going to end with the lessons of this pandemic, as far as I am concerned as a teacher, it is important to remember between yesterday's regrets and tomorrow's hope lie today's opportunities. Let's seize them with two hands. Let us not regret that we could not physically teach in a course for the last 2 years. Let us not lie in hope for when this virus will desert us and go to a different part of the solar system. Let us do what we can do today. And that's important. And that means let's go hybrid, let's go virtual, but let education not stop. And as I always say, my personal prayer, and I think as a human race, we have to have the strength to change the things we can change, the serenity to accept things we cannot. And most importantly, as teachers, we must have the wisdom to distinguish between the two. And what we cannot change in terms of the pandemic, we have to learn to accept, and we have to tailor our lives accordingly. Let not the teaching stop. Let's not say, I would love to teach when the pandemic ends, because people like Professor Pang are depriving hundreds of neurosurgical aspirants from his wonderful lectures by saying, let's wait. Remember, change is the only certainty in life. We have to embrace the change as an education committee. We have to adapt it to ourselves to the change. We have to accept the change. Remember, what is inevitable is not ideal. What is comfortable is not crucial. And most importantly, as my father always said, if you do not get what you like, you have to learn to like what you get. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Sandip. That was very well done, very entertaining. And while Graciela starts to share her screen, let me remind the audience that if you have questions or comments, enter them on the chat and we'll address those after Graciela's lecture. Graciela, you're next.
Okay. Good morning. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you, Nancy, for this invitation. Thank you, Sandip, for agreeing our moderator. And Sandip, after your excellent presentation, it will be difficult for me to account your argument. But today, I am the opposition, and to show that the pandemic will not drastically change pediatric neurosurgery teaching forever. In order to understand my view, we must go back to the history of the medicine itself. The dawn of medicine, and therefore of its teaching, date back to about 1800 years before Christ. At that time, in Mesoamerica, considered one of the 6 cradles of humanity, medicine was practiced by shamans. These shamans were experts who possessed the ability to communicate with superior beings and to influence them through prayer, sacrifices, or threat. They observed the stars, fire, animal entries in order to predict the future and to cure disease. They made medicine from plants and transmitted their medical teaching to future shamans. As they were continually at war, they soon learned to cure the warrior's wound, especially head wounds, which they considered to be the most serious injuries. If we move on to Europe, in 275 before Christ, Chalcedon founded the first school of anatomy, and in the 6th century, Almayran de Croto, a Greek philosopher, started simulation in medicine by introducing cadaveric dissection. The works of Galeno and of Leonardo da Vinci, as seen here, were great masters of anatomy. Andrea Vesalius was the founder of modern human anatomy and the classification of the human body, a master of future generations. From the Renaissance period, famous paintings dedicated to the teaching of anatomy are in Europe museums. Since the 17th, cadaveric dissection has been the gold standard for anatomy teaching. Even today, cadaveric dissection is considered essential for learning anatomy, but also for ethics. Some believe that no other teaching method can replace cadaveric dissections. The Greek professor of neurosurgery such as Drake, McBride, and Krayenbull consider cadaveric dissection to be invaluable in developing surgical skill. However, in 2020, Severino published that cadaveric dissection has decreased in many medical schools because the number of medical students far exceeded the number of donate bodies. Limitation of cadaveric models encourage the development of physical models to reproduce human-like responses for medical training. And so we come to the role of simulation in medicine. As the field of neurosurgery continues to advance, it is very clear that the operating room is not the ideal place for the initial acquisition of surgical skill. The sequences of moves in clinical practice cannot be repeated if failure occurs. Simulations allow surgeons and trainees the opportunity to practice a procedure beforehand. Simulation involves the use of models to imitate real-life experience. It has gained widespread acceptance in many fields, including aviation, safety, war strategies, and medicine. A high value has been placed in allowing trainees to perfect their skill, refine techniques, and avoid costly errors before operating in a real OR. In history, simulation has been used to practice difficult procedures by novices and experts. 500 before Christ, Greeks played Peteia. Peteia is a board game model on war to plan military tactics. 16th century, chess originated from a two-player Indian military game, one of the earliest games of strategy. 19th century, in 1812, George von Rauschwitz of the Prussian army designed the Kriegsspiel, a military game which later became the leading model for modern computer warfare simulations. Already in our time, the first simulation model emerged that were applied initially to teaching general medicine and later to teaching neurosurgery. Since the 1930s, flight simulation has become a training requisite. In medical education, simulation training is defined as a technique to replace or amplify real patient experiences with guided experiences artificially contrived that evoke or replace aspects of the real world in a fully interactive manner. The American Council of Graduate Medical Education has encouraged medical institutions to implement alternative methods of resident training, and that simulation is considered an important tool to complement traditional operative training. A recent survey of neurosurgery program directors across the US concluded that simulation is considered an important tool to complement traditional operative training. Different minimal invasive simulators has been introduced to improve preoperative planning and increase safety in neurosurgery. There are three types of simulator. Physical model, animal and human cadavers have been a standard method for surgical training. Limitations include biological and practical restriction, biohazard, tissue rigidity, and length of preservation. Second, virtual reality. Development of CT and MRIs have led to construction of 3D interactive systems which allow trainees to navigate cranial and spinal anatomy, but cannot reproduce the elasticity of tissue deformation. Third, mixed reality, a hybrid simulator. In this timeline, we can appreciate the evolution of the different simulation models from 1985 to 2002. Among medical disciplines, neurosurgery has pioneered the use of this technology. In 1950, Resushi arm was developed and created as the first CPR mannequin. And in 1967, the first computer-controlled anesthesia simulator was created in California. In pediatrics, in 2007, Roth introduced a computer-assisted 3D visualization and simulator system for fronto-orbital advancement in children with trigonocephaly. In 2014, Coelho developed a synthetic trainer for craniosynostosis. Mattei described a novel pediatric neurosurgery simulator for pediatric lumbar pathologies. Recently, Brainer et al. Introduced a synthetic brain simulator for endoscopic third ventriculostomy based on 3D printing technology. Currently, 3D printing has been used for operative planning, teaching and practice, implantation of prosthetic and biological tissue engineering. Finally, in 2015, the American Council of Graduate Medical Education encouraged teaching institutions to incorporate simulation methods in the surgical curriculum. The COVID-19 pandemic has only increased the use of the technology that already existed. In the post-COVID era, teaching will continue in the same direction as before, so there will be no drastic change in the theoretical teaching of pediatric neurosurgery, as already foreseen by the American Council of Graduate Medical Education in 2015. This is why I said that the pandemic will not drastically modify post-pandemic teaching of pediatric neurosurgery. Technological advancements were present prior to the pandemic. All of this does not substitute the acquisition of technical skill in operating room. But most important for a surgeon is practice as shown by Rembrandt century past. In Argentina, we say, en las canchas se ven los pingos. That means the players are evaluated in the playing field. It is true that during the pandemic, there were less patients due to fear of contagion, not having access to the transportation, general shutdowns, less accident, workforce and bed allotted to COVID patients in general hospitals, resulting in less elective surgeries. Even though there were less surgeries, there were more complex surgeries of advanced pathologies due to delays in receiving treatment. Even though trainees did not have the same access to routine pathologies, they did have access to more complex pathologies that allow for a crash course in surgeries. On the other hand, in children's hospital, the number of elective surgeries was not as affected because there were very few cases of children with COVID occupying beds in ICU as compared to general hospital. This permitted trainees to continue to access to the OR. After the first and second waves, the rate of elective surgeries resumed. We can assume that after the next waves, elective and emergent surgeries shall resume their usual rate. Actually, at the highest rate of infection, pediatric neurosurgeons are operating at our usual rate since the present mutation is more contagious than deadly. On the other hand, people are tired of the virtual and want to return to the normal. Various authors agree with this opinion and have said that the implementation of safety protocol has allowed to maintain elective procedure according to resources available. Trainees have maintained their range of surgeries and training. Here you can see different papers. In this from US, a global neurosurgery study agreed with this opinion. Sorry. This one from Iran. And this from UK. Due to all I have said beforehand, teaching pediatric neurosurgery after pandemic times will not change dramatically forever. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Graciela. That was wonderful. So thank you both for outstanding thoughts. I'd like to start with a question from Alexander Volashuk. Sandip, if you'll address this one. He wants to know about the future of international fellowships and observerships in the post-pandemic virtual teaching era.
Yeah, I think I alluded to that in my talk, Rick. I think we will have much more of this, what I call mentorship, which is fellowships and observerships on a 1:1 basis, because that will be incredibly more safer than having 150 people in one room trying to listen to a lecture in the future. So I think, organizations like the ISPN would be able to save a lot of money not having physical courses, and that could be diverted to having such international traveling fellowships. And I think we've already seen some progress in this direction in the last week from our colleagues, and Eileen has written to all of us just about a week ago saying that she wants to send people to go for short-term fellowships to some of our centers. So I think this is definitely something that will go on, and that will be much more important than didactic lectures held in a claustrophobic auditorium.
Okay, Graciela, any comments?
No, I agreed with Sandip said. I agree.
So Graciela, question for you. With virtual learning, we can teach anatomy, we can use simulators to teach technical skills, but by virtual learning, how are we going to teach a young aspiring pediatric neurosurgeon how to talk to a 3-year-old in the clinic, or how to deliver bad news to the parents of a child who's going to die? How do we teach the humanistic qualities that make us physicians by virtual learning? Can we do that?
I think it's not the same. It's not the same. I prefer, of course, head to head to explain the situation. Our specialty is very hard. It's very hard to explain by Zoom. I never, in these 2 years, I never did medicine by Zoom. I always continue maintain my operating room when I could, of course, and my office, always. I never practice by Zoom. I don't agree with that.
So you don't
Especially,
embrace telemedicine.
Our special is very hard. Our special is not only for children, it's for family. And family need face-to-face. My opinion and my work.
Sandip, you addressed the 3 H's, humanity, one of them, human characteristics. What are your thoughts? Can we teach the humanistic side? I mean, I never forget as a second-year resident watching my professor tell a family that their child was brain dead and was not going to leave the hospital. And I don't see how I can teach that over the internet.
No, Rick, I completely agree with you there. And in fact, with respect to Jeff's question that he's put on the chat box as well, what are the critical elements of in-person learning? I think the most important one single element of in-person learning, teaching, interactions, which you cannot simulate virtually, is reaction. The word reaction. And I think this is something that inevitably plays a huge part in how we communicate, because it's reaction of the parents that is very important when we're going to tell them what's going to happen to their child. It's reaction of the residents, which is very important when we're trying to teach them something. And I think that's the one word that is missing from the virtual platform, reaction. But I'm going to tell you that in the hybrid situation, this can be addressed to a great extent. We've just recently run a course at the Park Clinic in Kolkata, and we had a hybrid system where the lecturers could have been speaking from North America, Europe, or Japan, but they could see the audience in the auditorium while they spoke, and they could actually physically see the reactions on the face of the audience. This is something I really miss when I give a talk, because like Darkling, I think unless you see the reaction on the faces of the recipients, you just worry whether what you're saying is just, just falling flat. But here in a hybrid situation, you can see people, you can see them in the auditorium, and you can still talk to them from Birmingham, Alabama, and you can assess their reaction. So it's not impossible, and I think the technology can become two-way as well, and they can see you physically, they can see from where you're talking, and you can go on a ward round and be seen physically with your patients. And I think this is not ideal. By no means is it ideal. As I said, what is necessary is not necessarily ideal. But if we can't do otherwise, then we have to do the best with what we have.
I'll comment that having recently resumed in-person meetings at our American Congress in the fall, and a board meeting recently where we're actually back in the same room together, it's very poignant how much we missed one another, and how much different the interaction is when you're there speaking in person, or having dinner together at the end of the day, or having a nightcap before you go to bed in the evening, and how much business actually gets conducted outside of the formal lecture.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think most of us went to these meetings not only because we were wanting to teach or lecture, we went to ISPN courses because this was a great opportunity to meet up with friends. And, you know, I would meet people like Nelsie in the first week of the month in China and in the third week of the month in Chile.
Great
Very good.
times. Great times.
Yeah, they are. And those are the memories that stay with us forever. They really are. So,
I think
well, I don't see.
It goes
Okay.
just beyond the social too. It's not just an issue of, you know, having a meal. It's that interpersonal, humanistic quality that I think is so important that you all are alluding to so nicely. You know, just a brief comment. I think what we're really talking about here is that to do our profession well, there are various domains. And to do it really well, we have to have them all. You can't be an excellent humanist and not be able to properly diagnose and technically do the operation. Nor can you be a master technician and be poor in humanistic qualities and do our career well. That's one of the magical parts of being a pediatric neurosurgeon, is to do it well. You have to recognize that very special place of close, intimate, humanistic connection and technical capability and all that goes with it. I think those are the domains that we have to recognize, because different platforms of learning clearly lend themselves very well or very poorly. Just as Graciela was saying and emphasizing, it's probably very difficult to learn humanistic qualities over a digital platform. But at the same time, hearing Sandip talk about occult dysraphism, or Rick, you talking about two attending approaches and various approaches to difficult tumors of the midbrain. I heard those lectures a long time ago and can still visualize, think about them. That's a different skill set than that involved in talking to that 3-year-old brain dead patient's family. And I think each of the platforms lends itself to different components. And I think that for those of us that are going to work toward the objective of improving education, that's where we need to match the need with the platform, so that the digital platforms can be used to harbor the remarkable experience of the entirety ISPN family for faculty, and yet at the same time recognize the limitations of that platform for the very critically important interpersonal humanistic things.
Well, very good. Nelsie, I'll turn it over to you for the exit question and any final comments. But I thank everyone for attending and for these great talks. Both of you did a wonderful job bringing the subjects to the forefront. Thank you.
Thank
you. You're muted, Nelsie.
Thank you. Some comments. The virtual patients consultation for us is reality since the last 2 years. Brazil is a continental country, and help them to, we can see the exams and we can talk virtually with the parents when they are already our patients, helps a lot. And also discussing with other colleagues about surgical or conservative approach for the patients. And about the courses, what Graciela saying is on my mind for the next future. Maybe we can discuss together. Do virtual courses is very important, but since the pandemic times give us the opportunity, maybe combine these particular virtual courses with 1 or 2 days with hands-on in place, and maybe 1 and 2 days more to seeing the people in the operating room, not our faculty, our ISPN faculty operating patients, but help them with some advice or some intentionally help for them. It's just on my mind. We can maybe discuss on the future. And thank you very much, Rick Boop, for this wonderful moderation. Thanks, Graciela, for coming, for accept this challenging discussion. And Sandip, always my chair. I learned a lot from him on these last years, incredible person and professor. Do you like to have some final answers or final questions, Jeff? Please, Linda, can you put the question again, the poll, just to give you the feedback? At the beginning, 78% of the people agree that will change dramatically forever. And only 11% agree with Graciela that with no change dramatically the learning in pediatric neurosurgery. We will see if some of them change the mind after these beautiful and wonderful lectures.